Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the second Consciousness and Reality Colloquium for this academic year. I am Kunal Muley, an astrophysicist and the co-founder of IMIX, which is the Institute of Mind, Intelligence and Consciousness Studies. Our co-host today is Christoph Koch, and we have participants from Caltech, MIT, Stanford, UC Berkeley, University of Arizona, and IMIX. So the CNR Colloquium series seeks to inspire interdisciplinary investigations on a wide variety of topics that are relevant to mind, cognition, intelligence, consciousness, and the nature of reality. And before we introduce our colloquium speaker, I would like everyone to note that select questions from the Q&A box will be taken after the talk. So everyone should please submit their questions through that Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of the Zoom window. And I now request our co-host, Christoph Koch, to please introduce our speaker, Larissa Albantakis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kunal. First and foremost, my heart goes out to all of you at Caltech and in Pasadena and Altadena, all of you in the Los Angeles basin affected by the fire. I know it's a terrible situation, and I thank all of you for joining us. Today, and today's speaker is Larissa Albantakis from University of Wisconsin-Madison. She did an undergrad in physics and studied at the Max Planck Institute in Munich, calcium activity in developing neurons. Subsequently, she obtained her PhD in, I guess, computational neuroscience with Gustav Deco in Barcelona, studying decision making. And then she joined then Madison. She joined first the group of Giulio Tononi at Madison as a postdoc, and then she became her own faculty in psychiatry. So she does now, she is one of the pioneers of this field called computational psychiatry. And of course, she's made a name for herself as one of the founders of integrated information theory. In all sorts of ways, she'll tell us about regarding borders, regarding causality. She also has done a quantum mechanical formulation of IIT, and her specialty is really C4, C5, if you include calcium, complexity, causality, consciousness, and cognition. Larissa, take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Yes, the calcium is a long time ago. But let me share my screen, and then we can get started. You all see it? Okay, great. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me here, and especially for being here. I know that some of you might be having a very hard time right now, and I appreciate it very much that you tuned in to listen to this talk about IIT, of all things. And right, so I'm going to get started with an introduction on integrated information theory, and I want to focus specifically on the notion of causal borders and causal structures that are part of the integrated information theory mathematical framework. Integrated information theory was conceived by Giulio Tononi, and I believe that this article from more than 20 years ago now is the first that explicitly had information integration theory in the title, but still in the reversed order. Nevertheless, the ideas go back even further than that. And there was an update to the formalism, the first update in 2008, and then in 2014, this was the Integrated Information Theory 3.0, which is the first that received its own number, and that was the first one that I was majorly involved in. And now, 10 years later, we published the Integrated Information Theory 4.0, and you can see that the number of people involved in putting this forward has been growing steadily. And what I want to say here is that the basic features of IIT really have been there from the very beginning. And what has evolved is mostly the mathematical formulation of the theory, and that has become increasingly comprehensive. So while I certainly won't exclude that there might be an IIT 5.0 in about 20 years from now, right? This 4.0 version is the first supposedly complete account that aims to explain both the presence and absence of consciousness in general systems, but also aims to account for the quality of experiences without any further ingredients. So I always like to start with a disclaimer about what I mean with consciousness, just to be sure that we're on the same page throughout this talk. So when I talk about consciousness, I mean having an experience, what it is like to be, or as Christoph puts it, the feeling of being. And that means that consciousness is not just reflecting on one's experience. It's not just about the environment and our perceptions. We are conscious when we're having dream experiences by virtue of having experiences while we're dreaming. And it means also that consciousness is not just responsiveness, although of course, when we study consciousness and in the clinic, we're often using behavioral responses to judge if someone is conscious or not, but not always, right? So the goal of any theory of consciousness really should be to account for the experience itself, what it is, why it feels the way it does, and then why it has to do with some parts of the brain and not others. But over the last now 30 years, in the neuroscience of consciousness, we mainly ask yes or no questions. So, for example, is a subject conscious? Yes or no? Or is the subject conscious of some particular content? Yes or no? So there's a contrast between conscious states or conscious perceptions of specific contents that allows to infer neural correlates of consciousness. And there's been a lot of progress, but over the years, the limitations of this approach have become increasingly evident, namely that it's hard to address any of the why questions that we've asked just before. And so there's currently a bit of a revolution going on in the field of consciousness science. Some might call it a crisis, but I prefer to be optimistic here because there really is a possibility for a science of consciousness beyond just yes or no questions. And for once, we can investigate the structure of experience in a lot more detail than has happened before. So here you see an image of a visual experience of a person lying on a bed who sees their shoes and the bed, and it's a spatial experience, right? It has a spatial extent to it, and all of the locations and objects and different features of this experience have some specific relation to each other. And this is what we call the phenomenal structure of the experience. And when we analyze the substrate of consciousness, the physical substrate of consciousness, this physical substrate has to have a correspondence of this structure of experience that must be mirrored in some way in the physical substrate too, in order to account for the phenomenal structure. Now, we can also ask specifically about the extent and the nature of the substrate of consciousness, because there are many questions. So while we all, or we largely agree that consciousness is supported by parts of the cerebral cortex, which means that if there's a lesion from a stroke or something else in specific parts of the cerebral cortex, specific features of the conscious experience will not be possible anymore. This is not the case, for example, if someone loses their cerebellum, even though the cerebellum has a lot more neurons than the cerebral cortex. Other why question. So why this particular set of neurons are. So let's say we identify a substrate of consciousness, a subset of the cerebral cortex in wake, right? The same substrate when we are unconscious in deep sleep or anesthesia is not a substrate of consciousness anymore, right? Because we're unconscious. We can also take a step back from neuroscience and view consciousness as a physical phenomenon, which it ultimately is, right? And we can ask, why do neurons matter in the first place, or groups of neurons? Why is it not the interactions between the molecules that make up the neurons or the atoms that the neurons consist of, right? Or the microphysical description of the system, quantum mechanical description, for example. So,
Larissa, can I ask you something about border to clarify? That borders, you really mean, in principle, this neuron is part of the substrate, and this immediately adjacent neuron that's synaptically connected may not be part of the physical substrate of consciousness. Is that correct?
Yes, that is right. So drawing a border around a conscious entity, that's also called the individuation problem of consciousness in philosophy. And it's the idea, and I'm gonna get there, right? That so we have, let's say, a very simple test for any theory of consciousness, right? Would in principle be to give it a description, a physical description of a room full of, let's say, 3 people, right? And any theory of consciousness that it's worth its weight should be able to say that, well, there are at least 3 consciousnesses in this room, right? So, and they're distinct, meaning we can, what's part of the content of my experience might not be part of the content of your experience. My experience has definite content. There are things that are in and there are things that are out, and the substrate has to account for that, right? So there will be one neuron at the border that directly contributes to my experience, while the next neuron over might not do that, even though it still can interact maybe more weakly with the rest of the system. But let's look at this picture of the room, right? So most proposals to date, most theory proposals to date, do not have the theoretical tools to approach this individuation problem without presupposing brains as the seat of experience. And integrated information theory, as we will see, is a notable exception here. And to make this a bit more clear, I drew this, like, this is the physical description of this room, right? So there are atoms that are interacting, and physics doesn't really have a way to draw borders between entities, and no less conscious entities, right? And so in terms of interactions, there are no real physical borders between even the 3 brains. So, and even if we look at the level of neurons, there is a sense in which the neurons in the one person's brain are influencing the neurons in the other person's brain, right? Like me talking to you, there are some neurons that then will influence your neurons that are listening to what I say, right? Far away. So where does one consciousness start and another end? And another point I do want to make here is that I want to contrast this problem of individuation for consciousness with the question of life. So whether something is alive or not, leaving consciousness out of it, is ultimately a functional descriptive question, right? So if we had, we take the example, let's say, of a virus, the virus doesn't care if we call it alive or not, right? So it doesn't make any difference for anything that happens if we attach the label alive or not to the virus. There might be an objectively better or worse answer, but it's ultimately an extrinsic feature that we attach to this system of the virus. For consciousness, however, there really is a truth, an independent truth to the matter of whether a system is conscious or not, right? Either the lights are on or they're off. Either it feels like something to be that system, however little that may be, or not. But this is a very unique feature of consciousness, and it allows for another way of testing theories of consciousness that has nothing to do with what happens, but really about what there is, right? So there are facts to be explained that are about, in a way, a static sense of just how many beings are there, and can the theory account for that? So the goal here is an observer-independent way of identifying the borders of a system. Now, for our brain, let's say we have identified the borders, and like the best guess, according to IIT, for the extent of the substrate of consciousness is that the posterior hot zone, as it's called, these posterior areas in the brain are at least necessary, or are the ones that are directly contributing to the experience. And then we can look at the different regions. We can see that they are contributing differently to the contents of the experience. And there are many questions that can be asked here too, about what features the parts of the substrate must have in order to account for specific features of the experience itself, right? So, for example, most of our experience have some sense of extendedness, of a spatial feeling to it. So visual space, but also possibly in other modalities. We often experience a flow of time. For example, when we listen to a melody, there's objects that are categorically invariant, even though we see them at very different angles. We have a feeling that it's the same object. And then there are maybe the most obvious, the different sensory modalities that somehow our feeling of a visual experience is different from our feeling of an auditory experience or a tactile experience, right? And all these differences and distinctions have to be somehow accounted for by the underlying physical substrate. So clearly there should be, it should be possible to map consciousness with all its properties onto the physical world. But the main insight that lies at the foundation of IIT, that one should not start with the physical world and some parts of it, and then ask how these physical features might give rise to phenomenology, right? Because it will always seem unnecessary that a system that we fully understand and we know how it works has this experience with it that maybe doesn't seem to do anything, right? But instead, we should start with what we want to explain in the first place, which is the phenomenology, the experience, right? So we take the experience, its presence and its property, and so we ask, what are the features of this experience and how can they be accounted for in physical terms? And in order to do that, so we distinguish between essential and accidental properties of experience. So essential would be the defining properties that are true of all experiences that we can possibly have, but also that are conceivable in a sense. And they are very basic properties, right? And so in addition to these essential properties, then there are what we call accidental properties, which are really about the quality and the content of the experience, of very specific experiences. And those can be very complex, right? If you listen to a very rich piece of music, that might be a very complex experience, but of course, those properties are not part of your everyday experiences necessarily. And then at the heart of it, what IIT proposes is that there is an identity between the experience and the cause-effect structure of the substrate, right? So what that means, I will get to in a bit, but essentially, we can use the formalism of IIT to identify a substrate of consciousness. That substrate will have an experience, and the quality of the experience is determined by the substrate in its current state, but not just, the activity of the individual units, but actually by the entire structure of all the units and their combinations of all the different subsets within the substrate, and how they relate to each other, how they constrain each other in causal terms, and how those constraints overlap. And that gives you an informational causal structure that is specified by just being the system in this particular state. And the prediction, or the claim that comes out of IIT, is that that structure can account for the system's experience in this moment, and without any additional ingredients, right? And so I want to note that this is a very powerful prediction, which means that it can be falsified in all possible ways, right? There might be myriads of ways in which that prediction might not hold if something went wrong in the derivation of the theory. All right, so what that means, coming back to essential and accidental properties, is that with the essential features, so if a substrate can account for all the necessary and sufficient features of every possible experience, it will give rise to such a structure, right? So it will be a substrate that exists in some form as an entity, and that substrate will have a structure in its current state. And then the accidental properties are really about how the structure looks like in the present moment, what the properties of the structure are, how many, how symmetrical it is, how many high-dimensional pieces it has, right? The modalities might form different sort of high-dimensional substructures in this structure, and we can see whether the features of the structure can then account for the specific features of the phenomenal experience. And to summarize, I want to give you an overview of IIT's methodology, because what IIT is ultimately a whole research program. So sometimes I get asked, you're at IIT 4.0, doesn't that mean that IIT 1, 2, 3 are dead, and now you have a new theory? Why do you even call it IIT anymore, right? But the answer is that IIT is not its math, right? The math updates, but what it is really this new proposal of going about understanding consciousness. And it starts with the phenomenal structure and identifying the essential features of our explanandum, right? And then formulating these features in terms of physical properties, which in our case is identical. We take that to mean identical to causal. So physical is causal, and I'll get there. Causal features of the system. Then we get this cause-effect structure, and there's a claim of an identity between the phenomenal structure and the cause-effect structure of the system. Then we can start looking at the accidental properties and identify which specific physical systems, ways, and let's stick to neural networks, like which architectures of neural networks might account for which types of experiences. And we can try to see whether we can get a correspondence between certain phenomenal features and certain physical features. in these substrates. And we can take both the initial prediction that there should be a structure and the prediction about the accidental features and validate them empirically in human beings. Once we're confident that we're at least on the right track, right, then we can take the formalism and apply it to systems that are very different from us. So that would be, those are still predictions in some sense, but I like to make the distinction here between predictions that are actually testable. Testable means testing in human beings or systems that are very close to human beings, whereas the extrapolations are predictions that are not testable. They're and this is an important distinction to make, because there is no theories of consciousness cannot be tested by what they say about artificial consciousness, for example, right? So if because there really is no independent way of identifying if an artificial system is conscious or not. And I mean, we have our intuitions, but especially in artificial systems, we should not trust those, right? So in order to make claims about systems that are very different from us, we need a theory. And to validate the theory, we need to look in ourselves. Importantly, though, that doesn't mean that we're only describing human consciousness, right? So we're really looking for the feeling of being, like phenomenal existence. That is what we want to capture here. And it's much more broadly applicable than to humans. It's just that because consciousness is intrinsic, ultimately, the only way we have to test that is in systems that we trust to be conscious, just like ourselves. Okay, so let's get a bit more to the meat here. So what are the essential properties identified by IIT? So those are called axioms of IIT. So now some people get a bit hung up on the word axioms. In the end, what is meant is just the essential, the defining properties that have no further explanation, right? They're the starting point, and that's why they're called axioms. These properties are taken to be indubitable, and that means that if even though they're acquired or are identified by introspection, they're like we can reason about the fact that there really could not be an experience without these properties, because anything lacking these properties cannot possibly be an experience. Okay, so what do we have? The first one, which we also call our zeroth axiom, is that consciousness exists in the first place, right? So there is something. There is something that exists for itself, and that's the first axiom, that of intrinsicality. So there's an experiencer, and the existence like the experience exists for the experiencer. The experience is specific. It's the one that it is right now. There are many possible other experiences that we can have, but it has features that make it the way it is. And in that sense, it is very informative. For every distinction has myriads of features that are specified and distinguishable within it. Every experience is integrated, and this is a really basic property. So all of these properties are super basic, right? So all we mean by integration is that there's one experience. It's a whole, and if it wasn't one, it would be multiple. So it's really as basic as to say, it's almost a tautology, right? To say that it has to be one, because if it wasn't one, then there would be two. But the deeper meaning here is that if it was completely split, right, we wouldn't have one experiencer with two experiences. We actually would have two two conscious entities, right? And every experience is also definite, and we touched upon that with the border. So my experience has the content that it has. I can't see what's behind my head. My visual field has a certain extent. And it also has the spatial and temporal grain that it has, right? So, and the last one is the composition axiom, which is about the structure of the experience. So every experience has some contents, even if that reduces down to a very minimal experience. And these contents have some relation to each other. Okay, so the goal now is to take these axioms of phenomenal existence and translate them into requirements on a physical substrate. And so the experience is what consciousness looks like from the intrinsic perspective of the experiencer, right? But when we do science, we have to take the third person perspective, the perspective of the researcher. And from that perspective, when we want to investigate consciousness, we can only manipulate and observe the physical world, right? And when we do science and interact with the physical, knowing that there are physical existence means that there must be a way to affect something and to be affected by something, right? So if no one ever sees you and you never do anything, you might as well not exist, is the point, right? So the starting point for the translation is that physical existence means having cause-effect power. And that also means then that we can do science on the thing, right? We can manipulate it and observe it. And it also, so in mathematical terms, that means that we can assess these interactions in forms of what's called a transition probability matrix. So assuming we have some units, some causal units, they have at least two states. And by being in their state, they influence other units in the system. So they have causes and effects within the system, and we can note these effects by means of these transition probabilities, right? So for example, if I turn one neuron on, that neuron might very likely turn a set of other neurons on, whereas if I clamp it and it cannot fire, then some other neurons might fail to fire too, right? And so the important thing here for IIT, for our formalism, is that these transition probabilities aren't just observed probabilities, but we get to them by intervening on the system, by really testing all the possible states that it could be in, and this makes those probabilities causal probabilities, even though most of the formalism uses similar but not identical equations to information theory. Okay, so once we have this description of a physical substrate of interacting units, we can ask, what does it mean for such a substrate to exist intrinsically in a specific way, in an integrated way, in a definite way, and with substructure, right? And so the way we do this is to ask, so how do the causal interactions of the system need to be so that they fit with the phenomenal axioms? And the intrinsicality here is translated into the requirement that we look at how the units of the system influence each other and not how the system acts with respect to the outside world, right? So what we care about is how the units within the system constrain each other, while the rest, the behavior is clamped, so it's fixed or conditioned on, as we say in probability theory. Then each of these units within the system can specify information about other units in the system just by being in its current state. So we're we're taking the system in its current state, and just by virtue of being that system in that state, it has information about, like parts of it have information about other parts. And we test whether this information is integrated, meaning can we split the system in two, and do we lose any information if we do that? And because we require that every part specifies both causes and effects in the other part, it's a requirement of IIT that substrates of consciousness have recurrent causal connections. And the last one is that there needs to be a definite causal border. So we have to find a way to say that it's this set of units, and like, let's say this set of neurons, and even if there's another neuron that also interacts with it for some reason, and I tell you the reason, it's that in a minute. So, but for some reason, this neuron is in and this neuron is out, and we have this border that can be assessed in an objective manner, right? So, and not in an observer dependent. None of this can depend on us as the researcher looking at the system in a specific way. It has to be the property of the system itself in this state, the property of the system and also its environment in some sense. So intrinsicality means, in IIT, means that we look at how the sets of units constrain each other, but it doesn't mean that it's completely independent from what happens outside, right? So factors outside, for example, your sensory inputs, right, they will affect what you experience, and they can also affect what the substrate is. And then lastly, so the different ways in which subsets of the system constrain each other can be unfolded into what we call a cause-effect structure. And the cause-effect structure really specifies all the information that is present in the system across its various components, from the reduction of single units to all the subsets to the whole system, and how that constrains the causes and the effects of the system onto itself. And this here is just to show that starting from this transition probability matrix, we have math that can evaluate whether a system has all these properties, and what gets computed is what we call the integrated information of the system. So a subset of units that forms a substrate of consciousness has to be a maximum of intrinsic, specific, and integrated cause-effect power. And then once we have identified this subset as a maximum of integrated information, then we can ask what kind of structure it gives rise to. And this then is the explanatory identity of IIT. And if you want to hear more about this, I highly recommend that you visit the IIT Wiki, which is really an amazing thing that was put together by Jeremiah Hendren, Matteo Grasso, and Björn Jewell. They put a lot of effort into it, and I think it shows, and it's really a great resource if you want to learn about IIT. So I'm running a bit out of time. What I wanted to get to is two things. One is to talk a little bit more about the content of the experience. And here, I already said, the goal is to match the cause-effect structures that can be unfolded from certain substrates to certain experiences. And what has already been published in that regard is an account of the spatial extendedness, so our feeling of our visual field, let's say, being spatial in the first place. So this is not about identifying locations in space and being able to perform tasks. This is about the feeling that there is like a canvas that stretches out of you, in front of you. And another
Larissa, shouldn't you first explain the central identity to people? I'm not sure everyone is familiar with that.
Sure, I can go back to that. I had hoped that it was clear, but so the identity is that the experience that you have right here, right now, corresponds to the cause-effect structure of the physical substrate that is most likely in your cortex, right? In your cerebral cortex, some parts of it will specify your substrate, so that's indicated here. They have all the neurons or groups of neurons in that substrate relate to each other. They give rise to this highly, highly, highly complex cause-effect structure, and every aspect that's present in your experience right now should have some correspondence to in this cause-effect structure, right? And what we can say, and what I actually did not say, is that then we can also quantify this. Right? We can take all the what we call distinctions, so that are the subsets that specify causes and effects and their relations and the strength of their interactions, right? And sum those up, and that's now the a quantity. The big phi quantity in IIT 4.0 corresponds to this, the richness of the experience, which is just the sum of all the distinctions and relations in this structure. And then, as I think I said before, is that the way that the shape of the structure, right, the specific properties of that structure changes from state to state, changes with the activity of the neurons, let's say, or the units of the substrate. And at every given moment, the specific experience should correspond to your specific cause-effect structure. So that's the claim. Now, if I have a spatial experience, right, then some part of the structure should correspond to this spatial experience, and some part of the structure will will be spanned by a part of the substrate. Right? So there should be some neuron somewhere in the substrate that span a substructure that has all the properties to explain or to account for the phenomenal structure that corresponds to spatial extendedness. And this is described in this paper, and similarly for time. And so I'll skip this. This is to say that, what does it, so I said that a spatial experience has some phenomenal structure. What does that mean, right? So even if you stare at a black screen, all the spots that you could, in principle, focus on, that you can see, are there, and are there in your experience, and they have relations to each other. So even staring at a black screen, which can be, descriptively compressed into very little information, within your experience, it has to have a very rich structure, because all the different relationships between all the spots and all the locations, all the areas have to be there, have to have a correspondent in the cause-effect structure. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel them, right? So there couldn't be a feeling of extendedness without all these relations, and that's what we want to account for. And then to go back to the methodology of IIT in this particular case, so we introspect and characterize the phenomenal structure of question, why does space feel the way it feels? And then we can account for this feeling by a certain substrate that then can be unfolded into a structure that would in your brain correspond to some substructure, right? But and then we can try and see if we actually accounted for the necessary properties. And for space, the ones that we identified are all these properties of the phenomenal structure, how all the spots that you can see here relate to each other. And we can find similar relations in the unfolded substrate of just a small bidirectionally connected grid-like substrate. And then the secret to time then is to have is that it's very similar in terms of the relations, the one difference is that now we have a directed grid with some directionality to account for the experience of the flow of time. But since I'm running out of time, I encourage you to look into those papers, which the time paper just came out on the archive. So the gist of what I've told you about was that how a system does what it does really matters once we talk about consciousness, and specifically once we talk about the structure of the experience and the substrate of experience, right? And so I'll skip this. We have tested, so we have done these like little simulations with what we call animates. But the point is that with respect to consciousness, we can have two systems that perform the same task, right? Like running through this maze. And one might have some integrated information here. And then, if this was a real system, a real agent, then we could ascribe a minimal amount to consciousness to the system, whereas another one that behaves exactly the same way does not. And one aspect here is that there is this requirement of having causal borders, which is just not there if we have feed-forward systems, because there is no objective way to place borders, causal borders, on a purely feed-forward system, right? So they're all our inputs and all our outputs, and we don't have this recurrent integrated core. So recurrent connections are necessary. For agency autonomy, I didn't talk about that, but consciousness. Now, interestingly, there is a theorem that says that in principle you can perform any function that can be done with a recurrent network with a feed-forward network. So what that means is that it extends to this idea that even human behavior, right, could, in principle, almost certainly not in practice, be implemented with a feed-forward neural network. And that means that even for systems that act the same way as we do, there is no Turing test for consciousness from that perspective. It really matters how a system is doing what it's doing. Even recurrent systems may split into several wholes. So here I have one that it forms an entity, a causal entity in itself. Whereas this system that has similar dynamics, right, but it splits into two entities that are interacting. And finally, last two slides, we have just put the IIT computer consciousness paper on the archive, which has been 8 years in the making. But the essence of it is that we can take a system and simulate that system. So a system that has some integrated information, we can simulate that same system using a toy model of a von Neumann computer, and we can analyze the computer, and we find that the computer, even though it can perform the exact same function, it may splinter into many, many small systems. And that means that functional equivalence does not imply causal equivalence according to IIT, and that also means it does not imply phenomenal equivalence. And there is a real dissociation between function and the cause-effect structure. So here again we have this little 4-node system that has a tiny cause-effect structure. This cause-effect structure is which would correspond to its experience if this was a real system and not simulated. Then we can have a different system with different logic, but same number of elements that splits into two with even smaller cause-effect structures, the most basic you could have. And then we can simulate both of these systems on a computer, right? And the cause-effect structure of the computer will be very similar, no matter what it's doing, but very different from the system that it's actually simulated. And if you think about it, one reason for that is that while the computer can perform the same function as the system, it can also perform a lot other things, right? So it's not causally identical and not functionally identical in effect if you take into account everything that the system does. And this is what you have to do from an observer independent perspective, right? So you cannot just pick and choose that, oh, now with this program, the computer is functionally equivalent to the system, when actually, and all that it could possibly do is very different from the original system. That's just to give an intuition on why that makes sense. And the idea of the computer and the system being not causally equivalent might be more intuitive. That's it. I want to refer again to the IIT wiki and thank everybody who was involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Larissa, for that excellent and thought-provoking talk. Christoph, do you have anything? We'll let you maybe have a quick comment if you have any.
Yeah, it's a beautiful talk. Thank you very much, Larissa. The main thing, I just want to push a little bit more the central identity when you say corresponds to. So on the one hand, I have my experience of space. On the other hand, I have the causal structure. What exactly do you mean correspond to? Are they identical to? Is it the same sort of stuff? Or can you just do this mapping, one-to-one mapping with nothing left over on either side?
Yeah, so we call it an explanatory identity, right? And I have to say that so a lot of what you asked then becomes the realm of philosophy, like what exactly is the nature of the connection between the phenomenal and the physical. But first and foremost, so for IIT, the starting point is that the experience exists, right? In itself. Consciousness is the thing that exists. And then we find some physical description, but the physical world really is not something that we know exists directly, right? The only thing we know exists directly is the experience, but it's something that seems to be there and it can influence our experience. We can manipulate, observe things and changes what we experience, right? So the physical world really is the inference here. And that's so it gets the label operational in IIT. So there is an operational description that captures our third person way of describing or accounting for the first person phenomenal experience, but it certainly isn't reductive in the sense that the physical description cannot take the place of the phenomenal description, right? And it certainly doesn't explain it away, right? So you can't say, oh, because we found that this is what it is, consciousness is really an illusion or is just the physical interaction here, right? So the starting point and what exists and what is real, and the only thing we can know is real is consciousness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a couple of quick questions. While there are so many interesting questions already flowing in from the participants, just in the interests of the theme of this colloquium series, which is consciousness and reality, maybe a couple of quick questions, if you allow me to. Within IIT 4.0, can you and do you distinguish between mind and mental properties on the one hand and consciousness? So that's like a question related to the consciousness side of the theme. And on the reality side is, what is reality in the context of, as you mentioned in the talk, looking at physics starting from consciousness? Yeah, first, the mind, right? So cognition is what I would say is the functions that the brain can perform, right? And so the substrate of consciousness, what we're analyzing are the causal properties of the system. So they are definitely tied to what's going on in the brain, right? It's not magic. It's a physicalist approach. But
like a thought, for example, a thought is part of your experience because you experience it, and not because of any action that it might cause. Or so, and the interesting part is that you can. So IIT allows for the possibility of, like, unconscious functions that just aren't performed by your substrate of consciousness within the brain, but sort of bypass it, right? So that's the idea of what you can do unconsciously. And the substrate of consciousness is also not fixed over time. It can actually change from state to state. And this could explain something like binocular rivalry, that sometimes most of the time we take into account both the information comes from both of our eyes, but there are interesting experiments where these are in conflict, and then we typically only see what one eye signals and not the other, and then it switches. And so it could be that under normal functioning, a large part of the at least higher visual cortex is part of your substrate, but that may switch with more weird states, like when you're experiencing the binocular rivalry. Now, so IIT does have a lot to say about the physical world. Sometimes that makes even people in the lab uncomfortable when we venture out to actually make this claim. But so from the perspective of IIT, as I said, the physical world is taken as an operational descriptive. So like we assume that there's something out there in order to provide an explanation for our intrinsic experiences. But and the physical existence is translated into everything physical being relational and it can be captured as a cause effect, not cause effect, as a transition probability matrix in principle. Now, Christoph mentioned that we had a paper about quantum IIT, and part of that was to actually extend sort of the notion of the transition probability matrix to a unitary matrix, because that's more close to what we actually think of the microphysical description of our universe, right? So, and the interesting part there is that there are no intrinsic properties of the physical. So the physical is purely relational. There, like, what's an electron? It's just a number, right? And that can influence other numbers. And that's I think the picture of reality from IIT. So it's what we sometimes call it, what's really real are the conscious entities, and they're interacting. And to make this a coherent view, there's an implication. So we assume that in the end, every unit, every microphysical unit in the universe should be part of some conscious entity, either as what we call phenomenological dust, so a monad, a miniature thing that can affect itself, so it still must have two states and something like a self loop, or as part of a macro conscious entity subsumed there. Yeah, so there's a lot to say. I think there's some of that in the wiki, and if you're more interested in that, there's our paper on free will that has a whole first part on the ontology of IIT. Christoph, the co-author of that too. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, here's a question from Edwin Bryant, who's a professor at Rutgers, who I know. He asks something about dualistic notion of consciousness, referring to the concept that consciousness supervenes on neural states, but is an autonomous and distinct non-neurological entity. So is this sort of a notion of dualistic consciousness ruled out by IIT as a metaphysical or a philosophical a priori, or are dualistic models of consciousness simply not amenable to IIT's methodologies?
So I think so. There have been attempts to like squeeze IIT into several metaphysical frameworks, not by us, but by philosophers that are interested, ranging from functionalism and illusionism to dual aspect, Russellian monism, all this. So what to be very honest, from my perspective, all this discussion is a bit secondary if you understand what IIT is aiming for, right? And if you take the existence of consciousness as the primary starting point, right? And then you could go ahead and still say that it's dualistic. There is the physical substrate, and there is and it exists in physical terms, right? And then there is the experience that exists in phenomenal terms, and then you have this mapping, but I think that would be in a way failing to be consistent if with the very starting point that the only thing that we are certain of its existence is the conscious experience itself, right? Right.
Okay, great. Here's another one by Ludi Fuss, who asks, earlier you defined consciousness by whether we can measure cause and effect in the system. How do you see the evolution of our measurement systems impacting the way we understand consciousness?
That's a quantum mechanics question.
You can take it as that.
Well, so that might be above my physics level. I have a master's, not a PhD. So in the end, right? So maybe I should say, with the quantum physics paper that we did, we exclusively stuck to unitary operators. And there are many interesting things interesting problems that are unsolved in extending the IIT formalism to quantum mechanics. One is measurement, and the other is what if there's no measurement, like many worlds or something like that. There are also problems of even the starting point of IIT that existence is real, that we thought about. Now, the two things that do come from IIT is that we do think that a certain level of noise at the micro level is maybe not required. It's not required by the formalism, but it would add a lot of consistency to the entire ontology, right? So because noise allows units to have causal power on themselves, and at the same time also still have causal powers with respect to interacting with other units. And so that would enable the most coherent, I think, view of physics, that every unit in the end is part of or a conscious entity in itself. But I might just completely run past your question here, so I don't want to go too much further. There is the empirical problem of assessing the transition probabilities, and then there is the theoretical problem of starting from a perfect description of the transition probabilities. And in most of what we're doing, we're just forget empirical, right? So we're assuming we have a perfect description of the system, and then given that, we'll try to unfold and see what conscious entities are there. In practice, you're not able to perturb the system into all possible states. It might be sufficient to observe all units going through all the states to infer the transition probability matrix. Then for the brain, we have now optogenetical methods that allow us to assess better how the neurons interact and then extrapolate from, a group of maybe 100 neurons to thousands and millions and billions of neurons. Empirical is a problem. Most of the attempts to test IIT are either more higher level about the postulates themselves. It has to be integrated, it has to be definite, it has to be specific, and so on, and not about the very specifics of the substrate on the one hand. On the other hand, we can be more specific when we look at contents and see, for example, with the prediction of the temporal flow, of whether the regions of the brain that are implicated in our experience of temporal flow really have this directed grid structure that was predicted from IIT, right? So I'll stop here. I hope I have at least touched on your question.
Yeah, we'll do maybe just a couple of very quick questions and then end there. This one is on how does memory play a part in integration? In a way, remodeling an experience, which memory can do in the moment or after the moment, can make it seem like there are two experiences in one person. So have any thoughts on that yourself, Lisa?
Yeah, so two. So one, in principle, right, IIT allows for there to be multiple substrates within one brain. So that would be possible, and there can be special cases where that actually might be a very good prediction on what is going on, for example, in a split brain patient, right? So, however, if your question is motivated by the fact that you sometimes experience almost like an overlay of two experiences, right, then the answer is, well, that still is part of your one experience. What we would want to account for is that feeling of it being quite separate instead of integrated together, right? And that might, in the end, look like, an experience with two substructures that are not very related with each other, but the two substructures still arise from the same substrate. Now, with memory in general, the hippocampus, for example, is an interesting question of whether it's in or out, but we're typically at least not conscious of the process of retrieving from memory. And there's at least an idea that the hippocampus has more like the templates, and then they restore neural activity in almost the sensory areas that then give us, for example, a visual memory, right? So a visual memory would be the hippocampus recreating almost similar activity to when you had the experience, and that would then directly correspond to you having a very similar structure, causative structure, than when you actually had the experience. Yeah.
Excellent. And this one final question, which is sort of a rewording of something that someone's written on the Q&A box, and my own formulation of it is, does the formulation of IIT imply that only certain kinds of fundamental physical forces, like let's say electromagnetic, can mediate consciousness, while other kinds of forces, like maybe gravity, may not be able to mediate consciousness? Right. And in this context also, which objects in the universe can be conscious according to IIT 4.0?
Yeah, thank you. So there is a real possibility that, for example, gravity as the weakest force, right? So we would let's take a step back. We would start with a description of the dynamical evolution of the universe, including everything, right? So it would include gravitational interactions, electromagnetic interactions, and they would be part of the TPM, right? But then, because of the exclusion postulate, it could be that in the end, the tiny contribution of the gravitational force compared to other forces might basically never matter in determining causal entities. So it might fall out because it's just orders of magnitude weaker than the interactions that determine what how the universe condenses into entities, right? It might, however, be that there's a very low background, anything that isn't taken up by more macroscopic entities could be connected, so there could be a very weak spatial consciousness that exists at the bottom of reality. I'm highly speculating here, right? So better not quote me on that. But a spatial consciousness that is present in empty space, right, where there is no other force than gravity that sort of supervenes on the gravity, right? So that could, in principle, be an option too. And thank you. And if any of you have questions that I couldn't answer, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to correspond.
Great. Thank you again. So the next colloquium I'd just like to mention as a final announcement is the next colloquium in the Consciousness and Reality series will be on the 12th of February by Matthew Fisher, who will be presenting on a very interesting topic of whether there is any quantum processing going on in the brain. And so I would like to again finally thank you, Larissa, for that excellent and very, very thought-provoking talk. There are many excellent questions that we couldn't take, but maybe I'll send them to you by email later and then you can respond to those. I'd also like to thank co-host Christoph Koch, of course, and all organizers and participants who made this event happen. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Take care now.